Okay, so here is an overview of paper 3. We ran some revision sessions that students were unable to make, so I'm hoping this will be a short form of the paper 3 overview and some tips that I will give, a few tips. This will be a kind of a quick video. If you want to slow it down, please do so if I speak too fast, but I want to get through it in a relatively short time. So first of all, we're looking at the entire specimen paper for paper 3. I just put them side by side with the 4 electives: clinical, consumer, health, and organizations. Now, of course, most people are studying 2 units, and in our case, we're probably going to be doing the clinical and the health. So while there seems like there's a choice, there really usually is no choice on paper 3. Not as much choice as there is on paper 4, but we'll deal with paper 4 at a later date. Okay, so when you choose the 2 electives, be aware that the format is largely going to conform to what the specimen paper tells us. And we don't have any past papers that are officially published, so we have to work with this. So if this holds true, and it probably will hold true, that we're going to see some short sections that ask us to make links to a hypothetical situation. And here I've highlighted the questions that require links. Usually they involve fictional people, people like James or Asha or Khalil or Mr. Malik. So make sure that when you see a question referring to how one of these people will deal with a situation, that you're not just talking generally, but that you're weaving together details from their situation. So James has a mood disorder and had started to receive rational emotive behavioral therapy, or REBT, Explain how REBT can help James with his distress. Now, I have some model responses here for these two questions. One is for our clinical, the other one is for health. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but you may want to pause it and just look at how general knowledge is weaving in with some of the details from the stimulus question. So for example, we're not just mentioning James's name, that's not enough of a link. We're actually talking about perhaps the actual situation of him not feeling like his manager likes him, okay? Those are links. And the same thing is true with Khalil below. We're contextualizing our knowledge in his particular situation at work, okay? So not general. If you just go general, usually you're going to get only half credit. So link, link, link when it is necessary. This is very similar to last year when we did paper 2. There were lots of hypothetical situations on paper 2, so you could just transfer those skills over to paper 3. The next question often asks you to evaluate one of the debates. So here we have, again, clinical and health. So one of the evaluations is asking for how the nature side of the debate could have a limit or a weakness, and the other one is about the limit of the nomothetic approach. Therefore, it is a good idea to go through all the approaches, and not all the approaches, all of the evaluative points that you could make, debates, and try to think of a strength and a weakness of each side of that debate. What is a weakness of free will? What is a strength of free will? Now, this slide here lists some of the issues and debates, but later we will go through them a little bit more patiently and just highlight some of the strengths and weaknesses of each. I have slides for that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, but most students are really curious about the long stuff. They're curious about the 6-pointer and the 10-pointer. That is a describe question followed by an evaluate question. Now, if you're using old past papers from the older 9990 syllabus, you will notice this is an 8-point question. But what makes the older questions more challenging than the newer format is that they're much more open and therefore require much more retrieval memory. So for example, if the question were to ask, describe what psychologists have discovered about measures of stress, I have to go into the recesses of my memory to figure out what part of the syllabus is that and what were some of the bullet points. Whereas in the newer version, if it's not a key study, if it's a more general concept than a key study, they are probably going to use these bullet points. And that's kind of a good thing. It could be a bad thing because it limits you, but it's a good thing because it gives you focus. And it also gives you a paragraph structure. I think you should be aiming for 2 paragraphs, one corresponding with each bullet point. Now, if they ask about a key study, for example, Oric et al. Or Brudvik et al., could you still paragraph? I would say please, please, please paragraph, because nobody likes to read a whole wall of text. So if you were doing a key study, I would paragraph by maybe procedures for one paragraph, and then results and conclusions for another. But we're not talking about a case study right now. We're talking more about a general concept. So using recording devices for brain functions to measure stress, we probably want to use one of those EEG studies, not a case study, but one of the EEG studies on the syllabus. Most students use these, most teachers use these because they are more prescribed and they're in the textbook and they're easier to access. So hopefully you remember Wang et al., who made people do simple math problems in an fMRI machine. Now, if you do not remember the name Wang et al., don't panic. You could say, according to researchers. I would prefer that students know the names of the EEG studies, but don't panic because there's a lot of them. So the second one, most students remember that people on a train were getting tested for their cortisol levels in saliva. They could probably talk about that very descriptively without the names Evans and Wiener, but hopefully you do remember the name Evans and Wiener. If you don't, again, don't panic. Just say according to researchers who did blah, 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 blah. So again, in short, the new syllabus format or the new exam format is much more pointed in the direction they would prefer you to go, a lot less open. And if you forget details like how many participants were in it, or perhaps some of the results, remember this is all positively marked, so you give as much description as possible. Numbers are great, names are great, details are great, but we're not going to punish you for forgetting how many participants there were. It would be nice if you had that, but you could find those points in other places. Maybe you remember something about the procedures. So for example, with the grant study, there were lots of people in there. I don't remember the number, but maybe I remember the dosages of nalmefene that people took, 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, etc. So there's ways to compensate for lack of details. And you're not expected to be perfect. This is why sometimes the thresholds are really low to get an A. Perfection is very rare. We want it, but it's not expected. Okay, evaluation. This will be the same question as A, but the word describe has been replaced with evaluate, and there will be a named issue at the end. Now, notice here that the named issue is not an issue in debate. It's not a typical evaluative point. It's a method. And so you have to expect that it could be nature-nurture, it could be generalizability, or it could be something like, for example, the use of experiments or the use of qualitative data. So there are three broad categories that I could outline here. There's the typical topics that we talked about mostly in AS year when we talked about strengths and weaknesses, GRAVE. And those are still good. But this year, there's much more focused on issues and debates. Things like free will versus determinism, holism versus reductionism, etc. And the last category is methods. So in this example, quantitative data, which has both limitations and benefits. And you could be kind of gray about it. You don't have to be all negative or all positive. You don't have to think about these as if you were writing a paper one from last year where it's positive, positive, negative, negative. You could be more nuanced, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. A piece of advice I've never given before, and this is a new piece of advice, is you may want to consider drafting an essay with a paragraph that fits each category. And the reason why I say that is I often find that when I'm reading essays, the paragraphs start to look the same. They become very samey. And we know that we want a range of topics. And it says here a good range of issues. What does that actually mean? Well, we know that the word range is defined by Cambridge as at least 3 topics. 3 is how they operationalize range as 3 or more. Could you write 4? Yes, I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a lot of time left on the exam. Me personally, I would do 3 developed paragraphs. And if there's time at the end of the exam, maybe I'll sneak in a 4th. But 3 is how they define range, or is the minimum requirement for range. So why am I giving this advice? Well, I've seen many essays where the 3 paragraphs are pretty much saying the same thing over and over again in just a different way. So for example, if it were the ORIC study on genetic causes of bipolar disorder, well, nature-nurture is obvious. free will determinism. If you have the gene, you might be stuck with bipolar. That might be obvious. And then something like individual situational. So DNA, 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 it all becomes a little samey after a time, and you just feel like you're reading the same paragraph over and over again. So if I did one paragraph on nature nurture, and then I did another one on, I don't know, controls or validity, and then I did another one on the use of quantitative data, those are going to be very distinct from each other. They're not going to start to bleed into one mess of an idea that's separated by 3 paragraphs. So that's just some free advice I'm going to give. You don't have to take it, but it's one thing that I'm going to start to pay attention to when I teach this in the future. Okay, so that's the first piece of advice for the evaluation. The next piece of advice I have is please write the named issue as your first paragraph. Because if you accidentally forget to mention quantitative data, the highest you can get is 4 out of 10. So it doesn't matter how awesome those other paragraphs are. If you're missing quantitative data, you're probably cutting yourself really short of a good score. Okay, also notice the format of the example that's written on the screen. Notice that the first sentence is not detailed, and it's not about a study, or it's not about an approach. It's about what is the topic of the paragraph. So the topic sentence is simply saying both of them have advantages in that they use quantitative data. Or you could even widen it further. You could say both of them use quantitative data, which can cause strengths and weaknesses, or problems and benefits, or something like that. This allows me to include both bullet points in the paragraph. You don't want to have just one bullet point per paragraph. That's not a good format. Unless you're doing a case study. Case studies are much easier. You could just talk about one study, but you want to be able to actually pull both into one place. You can make comparisons, you could draw contrasts, things like that. You could be nuanced. So for example, if you were talking about the nature-nurture debate with fear or anxiety formation, you have little Hans and you have little Albert. Okay, so both of them seem to be nurture because obviously behaviorism is nurture. You're clanging a metal bar, that's the environment. And then with Hans, you have environmental issues like the mother threatening to castrate the son, or the horse scaring the boy in the street, or something like that. However, they don't have to be on both or extreme ends of the spectrum. You could simply say they are both nurture, and you justify that. However, little Hans is relatively less nurture because Freud believed that all people go through these psychosexual stages. Therefore, it also includes some nature. So again, don't be black and white if you could prevent being black and white. Okay, so moving on, what are the various things that are issues and debates? Well, these are the lists that Cambridge gives us. I use the stupid acronym RAIN DICE, but it's really not that important. It just helps me remember to list them, get all 7 of them in one place. Is that 7 or 8? 8 of them in one place. But the ones in red, nature, nurture, determinism, free will, individual, situational, like I said before, they kind of bleed together and they don't become very distinct from each other. And so just to remind you again, they're kind of samey usually. You could easily practice evaluations just by solving for X and solving for Y. You could just take one of the content headings in the syllabus, stick it in the first part, and then choose a random issue, debate, GRAVE thing, or experimental method. So for example, evaluate the Brudvik study, including a discussion about ethics. Okay, that's a key study, so you don't really need to grab a whole heading from a syllabus. Or you could say, evaluate the treatments of OCD, including a discussion about nomothetic approach, or something like that. Okay, as I said before, you should know some positive and negatives for each debate, for the shorter evaluation questions especially. So I'm not going to talk through these slides because honestly I've been talking all day and I don't want to talk through them, but I am going to go through them and I'm going to just say you may pause it, read it in your own time. I think most students have seen this already, so you may already have this somewhere in your notes. Okay, I will conclude by talking briefly about cultural differences. The Hodder textbook goes into length about the different ways that cultures could be different. Do not get overwhelmed by this. I, for example, usually talk about individualism versus collectivist cultures. Some cultures are accused of being more collectivist than others. So if there's a study with a lot of people who are working towards a common goal, this is usually true more with organizations. But if you think about something like the Fox study about minds, you may think about, well, that would work better in a collectivist culture where coworkers might be more willing to be supportive of each other in this stamp program or whatever. There's a lot here, but you don't need to go this deep if you don't want to. It's just there and it's available to you. I want to remind you of one more thing. I'll go back to this slide real quick. So GRAVE is just last year's stuff, just repackaged into A2 material. But if you look carefully at the syllabus, I've said this before, but I want to repeat it, there is a subtle mention of temporal validity. And so just be aware that there is a small chance that you will be asked about temporal validity. So let me just quickly find a slide for you on temporal validity. So this is what it says in the syllabus. Students should be able to describe and evaluate studies based on validity, including temporal validity. It's another type of external validity, similar to perhaps ecological validity. But ecological validity is about space. Is this situation like another situation? And temporal validity is about time. Is something that happened in the 1950s still relevant today? So for example, well, one of the most famous examples would be like social experiments on conformity. But to make it more relevant to our syllabus, we could talk about things like the Janus and Feshbach study on tooth decay. You know, children who saw, or young people who saw the images or heard about the graphic images were not motivated to brush their teeth. And the belief is that the message was too graphic or too fear-inducing. Whereas today, young people tend to be more exposed to graphic or disgusting imagery, so therefore they could handle it better. So maybe the findings of something in the 1950s doesn't apply to 2024. This is especially true for consumer psychology. So a lot of stuff in consumer psychology is outdated. A lot of the advertising stuff is in magazines or television ads, or perhaps there's stuff about menu design, but nowadays a lot of menus are digital, not physical. So I don't know if it's going to come up for clinical that much or if it's going to come up for health, but just be aware there is a small possibility that they could ask specifically about temporal validity in one of the papers. So just be aware of that. A lot of teachers miss this because of the old syllabus. If you didn't pay close attention, you could have missed it because it's only mentioned in a small place. All right. All right, guys. Hope that was helpful. Sorry I didn't narrate everything, but I'm kind of knackered, and I hope this was helpful. Please pause and rewind and peruse at your own discretion. And we can't speak 24 hours before the exam, so I hope you forgive me if I don't respond to questions before the exam. Okay, good luck.